This section is going to be on configuration and deploy. And the end. So 1 more hour. Let's go through it as quickly, and hopefully I'll cover everything that we need to know about how to configure your application and deploy it out to a hosting site. I'm going to use Rails Machine, which is pretty damn easy because they give you a lot of tools that allow you to do it without too much work. So with configuration, as we said, hey, there is no configuration, but there actually is just a little bit, and we'll show you what it is and how to get started. There's actually only one thing you really need to configure. There's a nice tool that comes along with, it's an add-on for Rails called Capistrano. Capistrano used to be called Switch Tower, and then it got into a name collision with another product, and they had to change it. I guess they lost. So they changed it to Capistrano, which I believe is a deli meat. And it works. It does a great job. Similar to Rake, it's a domain-specific language for deploying your application to sites. People have actually used it even to deploy Java applications. I heard of a couple of instances because it is very flexible and very easy to configure. I'll then show you a little bit about Mongrel, and then we'll talk. We just delayed the routing and RESTful stuff till the end, so I'll try to pile through, and if I can get to all that, I'll be there, and I'll be deploying my RESTful application for you, just to be to do the high wire act at the end of the conference, and show you how quickly I can destroy my production site. So I should be getting calls. Let's see. First configuration file you'll need is basically, and pretty much the only one when you're developing, is this one right here until you start getting some more creative stuff. I'll show you some more creative stuff too, but this is basically it to get started. Database.yml contains your database connection information. Armando went a little bit over that. And all you got to really tell it is how you're going to connect up to your database, what adapter you want to use. The default is MySQL, and pretty much the username and password. This is about it. So you have a development database, and basically you get your username, password, test database, username, password, automatically generates a lot of this stuff for you, and your production database, and so forth. That's about all there is to it. Once you configure that, you're done. You're ready to start developing. And that's what's nice. You can get yourself up and running really fast, create the database, and go. There's a lot of other things, of course, that you can configure. Rails is pretty open. It has a lot of features that it needs a little bit of help telling it. By default, session management is going to be done using the file system. It's going to create what are called pstore files. Pstore are basically just serialized Ruby objects in the data on the file system. Not all that creative. There's going to be one per session. So a lot of people don't like that. It's kind of gross. I don't like it. So the first thing we want to do is put our sessions into the database. Well, it's really not that hard. There's one line in your environment.rb file. Most of your configuration, your generic configuration, comes into this file called environment.rb. There's a big block in the middle of it where all your configurations go. And that big block, basically, one second. Let's see, way down here. So, unfortunately, my screen is a bit small here. In this file, you have this big block right there, which is your configuration block. And if you'll notice, you have a lot of these things which you can change. They pre-populate them. The configuration by default is also listed there. So you change this one line here that says, I want to put my sessions into the database like that. I won't do that because I'll blow my deployment. And I just do this thing here, rake db sessions create, or create session table. And that will create the session table for me. And it just sets everything up for you. Now you have sessions and you're stored in the database. That's about all there is to it. You can also, there are other session stores as well. You can store them in memcached. You can store them in DRB. There's a lot of different options. talk about a little bit about logging. Basically, you can change your logger. One thing that I use in some of my production stuff is the Hodel 3000 logger. Sounds a bit like a vacuum cleaner, but it's a very nice logging scheme that provides for very easy to parse log messages. And the nice thing about it is I have a whole bunch of tools I can also use on top of this to be able to exactly replay all the actions that were taken during my application's execution. So if I find a problem, if somebody complains about something, I can actually go to that point in my log and say, okay, I can go through the exact steps that you went through when you were trying to use my application, repeat that operation, throw it into a test, and there I go. So it's very helpful. It also has a lot of statistics, like how long each operation took. So I can check my database access times and many other things, which will tell me how long somebody stayed on the database, on the application, so I can get my exact session times and do numerous stats. So there's just a couple of things you can do. There's a thing called Action Mailer. We didn't get into it because there wasn't enough time. But Action Mailer allows you to send mail and receive mail from your application. To send mail is very simple to set up. Now, up here we have a different file. We have config environments production. There are 3 separate files which can be used to be able to have environment-specific configuration. So your production and your development and your production, development, and test environments are all going to use different configurations for mail. You don't want your development environment sending mail, because you may have users in there that won't be too appreciative of when you send mail. In your test environment, you definitely don't want sending mail. So only production sends mail. So basically, what do? So we just say, the first piece is raise delivery errors. That's true. I just want to get exceptions when delivery fails. You can set that to true or false. Action mail delivery method, you can either use SMTP or send mail, whichever you want. Then you give this server settings, which basically tell it the address and the port and all, how to reach your site and so forth, and password to the SMTP server. That's in your production site. In your test environment, you want to say test. Test basically stuffs the mail messages into a mail queue, which you can then use a whole bunch of nice test helpers to be able to figure out whether mail was sent, whether it was sent to the proper place, and analyze it similar to the way you do with views. So that's pretty much all there is to configuration. You're done. Now let's go ahead and let's find out how to deploy our application. So we got our application. We've tested it. Seems to work relatively okay. And now we want a deployment. So what does CAP do? CAP basically gives us a domain-specific language to be able to specify how we're going to deploy this thing out. There's a lot of, again, conventions and defaults set in Capistrano. Certain certain organizations, like, not an organization, but a company like Rails Machine gives you actually a gem plugin, which makes it really easy to do. There's other ones, I think Joyent and TextDrive, they all have their own little plugins which basically conform to their environment and make it so that you can, within about 3 or 4 steps, as I'm going to show you, hopefully, will deploy an application out there. So it's all rule-based, and one of the nice things is I can change any of the actions. I can put before and after actions in there. There's some basic recipes for Rails. The recipe that comes with is for a fast CGI deployed application, but I'll show you how to do Mongrel. Actually, this thing is set up for Mongrel. And you can do your initial deploy in 5 minutes. And if I don't do my initial deploy in 5 minutes, something probably horrible has happened. And after that point, to be able to upgrade your site. So let's say you make some changes, you change your schema, and you want to shoot out a new version. It only takes about 30 seconds to do this. It's really fast. It tends to reduce the fear of deployment. I find that with other sites, it was so complicated to deploy that you'd have this sort of fear, and you'd plan them, and you'd have all this rollback mechanisms in place, and everybody sort of huddle around during the deploy cycle and say, oh no, is it going to work? And then often doesn't. With this, I found that I was doing intraday deploys, and because this thing was very reliable and I had a lot of tests, I knew the damn thing was going to work. I just kind of did a cat-a deploy. It all went out there, and I knew that I had a backup strategy. The thing automatically keeps previous versions around, so you can always roll back. So I know that it's not going to kill me. So in the world of Rails, or in Capistrano, you have, by default, again, there's a lot of defaults, there are 3 basic roles. There's your web server, there's your application server, and then there's your database. In the simplest, where you have a single machine, these are all the same boxes. In a larger situation, you'll have your web servers on one machine, and you'll have a bunch of application servers behind that, and then you'll have a couple of database servers. And you want to be able to manage all of those. You want to be able to say, in one line, you want to be able to say, deploy this to all these different machines, and make sure that everything goes smoothly and everything happens in the right order. And that's what Capistrano does. It orchestrates a lot of parallel remote operations without you having to do much of anything. So to get started with Capistrano, you just say cap minus apply to, which basically tells it to apply to the current directory, and then you tell it the path wherever that app lives, and then you give it the app name. And last thing it does is, as you're upgrading, it also will put up a page that says, system maintenance or something like that. That's all sort of baked in. But basically, to get started, you shoot that out. And what's in the box? Well, it gives you a whole bunch of pre-coded deploys. And what you need to do, what you have to tell it about, is basically what your application name is. You already did that. You have to tell it the target directory where you're going to deploy. You're going to have to tell it the name of the domain where you're going to be deploying to. A user name to deploy as. You're going to have to tell it also about your source configuration management system. They support a lot right now, as Subversion, CVS, Perforce. I think there's others as well. And which is Rails environment. It's default to production. You just don't want to change that. And once you're done with that, basically, that's it. I can show you an example deploy.rb file that I've already set up. And as you can see here, this is the RESTful application. We're going to deploy to this location right here of our www.apps application. The user is going to be deploy. And this is how we're going to get at our Subversion repository, svn plus SSH. And our Rails environment is going to be production. And let's see, our domain is this domain right here, which I've co-opted from one of my other domains that I have. A couple of other things you can set up if you want to. I have to set up this right here, which is the Apache default vhost. That's because I have other applications running. If I didn't have other applications running, I could just blow away my httpd.conf file and everybody would be happy. This thing actually sets up your httpd.conf file. It sets up your application comp files, does all that work for you. The Apache proxy is because I'm setting up 2 of these guys to run. That's by default. Apache proxy servers is 2. So it sets up all this information for you. This is from Rails machine. This is part of their thing. And then it has mongrel options, which I took all the defaults for. And basically, what this does is it is the recipe for deploying this application out there. That's in the box. So you get a lot of built-in tasks with it that you can say, cap, whatever. So setup is one of them that comes actually with Rails machine to set up the environment. Deploy is another one. Deploy with migrations is one of the standard ones. Deploy with migrations basically says, I'm going to deploy, check out all the code, and then I'm going to migrate the database, and then I'm going to bounce everything. Rollback, basically, oh crap, I didn't mean to do that deploy. And you can also do things like diff from last deploy. So you can say, OK, what has changed between this version and the last version? I can also do a cheap deploy, which is basically just update code. Let's say I just changed one of my CSS files. I don't feel like actually going through the whole thing of checking it out and restarting the server. I can say update code, and it'll just do a svn update on the directory and pop that new file in there. And then there's also a cleanup. As I said, it always keeps around old versions. So it keeps 5 versions by default. It will keep accruing versions. If you do a cleanup, it will clean up everything but the last 5 for you. So anytime you want, you can just hit cleanup and basically make the old versions go away. This is all command line stuff. Of course, there are conventions. And this is just the way things, well, this way Rails Machines does it, and a couple of the other hosting companies do it. And I find that it's a really nice way of organizing your information. So I'll put it out there just to kind of guide people in the right direction. We have 3 separate directory structures. We have a shared directory, a releases directory, and a repos directory. The shared information are things like logs. You don't want every single time you do a deploy to have all your logs blown away. You also don't want to have things like your media blown away. So if you have a directory underneath, let's say your images directory, where you're going to store pictures of your users, you don't want those pictures to go away just because you're doing another deploy. So what we do is we put them into these shared directories, and then as I'll show you later, you can make symbolic links between those shared directories and your deploy directory once you do the update code. The other thing is PID. PID files are kept in the PID directory, and that's for things like your mongrels and other daemons that you may be running. Again, you don't want those to be blown away, because if those get blown away, you may have a zombie process running that is going to be doing horrible things. So the other directory is your releases directory. Now, what you're going to get is underneath the releases directory, you're going to get one time-stamped directory for every deploy you do. And there's going to be one other symbolic link to the latest release, which is going to be called current. And that current basically tells you what is where everything is going to be running under. And then the last directory structure you have is repos. Repos is just going to be your SPN repository, whether it's CVS or Subversion or whatever the hell goes in there. And this is the current. So it's going to be basically, this is a release date. Your releases are managed, so you have the 5 latest releases. You can roll back and forth. The way it does it is every time you do a deploy, checks out the entire code base into a completely fresh, clean directory structure. You don't overwrite your old files. And then you create all the symbolic links to your shared stuff, and then it basically bounces everything. That way, if anything goes wrong during the release process, the system is still fine. It's still running, and everything should still work the way it used to, because basically the app is still running off. The current hasn't been moved. It's still pointing to the old release.
What happens to the database? Once you've updated your database schema, then you're kind of stuck. You have to unupdate.
You have to back out to the previous version. So that's why in your migrations you have the up and the down. The down will take you back. If something fails if you're doing a deploy with migrations and something fails during the migrations, you have a little bit more trouble.
You don't copy the database, I take it, during migrations?
It doesn't by default. There's a cap task also to back up your database if you want to. Maybe a good idea. Some of the companies I work with have databases that are multiple gigabytes, so backing them up, if they're 18 to 20 gigabytes, just sometimes is not an option. So what I was talking about before, basically these symbolic links and things along that line. So here, I'm just creating so after the update code, you can create symbolic links wherever you want. Basically, this is creating one from the common directory in the subscription mailer, because I want to be able to use certain view partials within my mailers. The other thing you can do is you can run commands. So if I'm going to restart my mongrel daemon, I have this daemon start thingy that I can put here. It's going to stop the restart, and it's going to stop the daemons and restart them. So I cd to a path and then do this. I can put whatever commands I want in there. And there's these before and after handlers. So before restarting mongrel cluster, I can run a certain command. After the update code, I can run any series of commands. So it's pretty flexible, and they have all these triggers that will follow that you can put in there, which will happen before and after. Makes it pretty easy. So I was going to talk a little bit about deployment and what the standard architecture is. So in a standard Ruby on Rails application, you have a number of bits and pieces. So you basically have like Apache or Lite or whatever in the front. And what that's going to do, the standard sort of production style deploy, if you're not using fast CGI, this is the best way to do it usually, especially if you're using a VPS type of system. You have a cluster of Mongrel instances running. You can run, as I said before, they take about 70 megabytes. You can put them on multiple machines, like 6 per machine, and then have n number of machines. Each one can do usually about 100 requests per second for a reasonable website. That way, kind of calculate your scalability from that. Usually 1 or 2 database instances behind that, and then they're connected up like this. So basically, that's it. The Mongrel is just a little HTTP parser, sort of like Tomcat, sits in front of Rails, handles the HTTP requests. It's usually best to have Apache handling your static content delivery, and then Rails to handle your dynamic content delivery. With what we didn't get a chance to talk about is things like a page and action caching and a whole bunch of other caching that's built into Rails when you want to turn it on. You can actually handle it right from Apache. So in a database, we support lots of different databases, MySQL, Postgres, Oracle, MS SQL, and Sybase. There's a lot of adapters, DB2s out there. People are continually writing adapters for this thing. So basically, we can use Capistrano to deploy almost anything. It's sort of built in for Rails, but you could use it. I've seen it used to deploy a Java application, which was kind of amusing once. But it's very flexible, very easy to use. Mongrel itself is developed by Rails Machine, and it provides that application server. It's a very lightweight container. Joyent has scaled Mongrel up to 4,000 requests per second. I don't know how the hell they did it. They're the guys who host Twitter. And one of their tricks is they use the Big IP L7 load balancer, which is a really nice little appliance, if you can afford it, which will do application content-based load balancing. So it's not just going off of some kind of round robin or something cheap like Apache does, but it actually looks at the type of request, can parse the entire HTTP headers and everything, and basically redirect to a number of different clusters. So you can have clusters that are specific to a certain piece of functionality, can cache certain content, and really can kick you up. So they have some pretty heavy iron going at this. I think they're using 48 mongrels as well to be able to drive their application. So not a huge amount of iron, and they're getting really good request response times on a very, very dynamic application. The other thing I want to talk a little bit about is what's called background DRB. It's a plugin for Ruby on Rails, and basically it allows you to do things like long-running background processing. So one of the complaints about Rails is that, oh yeah, you're single-threaded. You don't, if you're not fast enough, the user is going to be waiting just on a little spinning thing. Well, basically you can offload processing to background workers. And background DRB is using something called distributed Ruby DRB, which is a very simple method of sending Ruby objects to and calling remote methods. And there's a tie-ins to Rails itself for being able to pull whether something is done and check for progress. So basically, your request goes back to Rails. Rails calls this middleman object. The middleman object then forks off a worker, updates the progress dynamically, and the progress is then shot out to the browser. You can imagine, put a little bit of Ajax in front of that. You can update like a progress bar about how this thing is doing. This is good for doing things like converting documents to PDF or doing some image magic or image science work that take a few more minutes than you would want somebody to have to wait. And it's pretty cool. So I just wanted to mention that because it's something fun to use. And when people talk about performance, that's one way of being able to get yourself some extra performance and make your application look very snappy. Let's talk a little bit about routing. Routing is Ruby's magic for being able to both parse URLs as they come in, as well as generating URLs. Now, as Armando showed before, we had all these helpers, like where you said colon action, arrow, whatever. And as people are probably wondering how the hell that stuff gets turned into a real URL and how it knows all this stuff. And routing does look like a lot of magic, but behind the scenes, it's a bunch of very interesting patterns and its own sort of DSL for describing how you want to handle incoming requests. The other thing is that there's now the adoption of REST, and I'll get into REST a little bit later in this if we have time. So, simple routes. So this is what you get when you when you do a general install of Rails. Right out of the box, you get this basic route file. Okay? Saying, what the hell does this mean? Well, basically, most of what Armando showed you is this line right here. So a map connect, what it does, there are three pieces. The controller, as you know, refers to the controller. So this would be like the student controller, student, action, new, create, whatever, :ID, optional pieces. That map connect basically parses out the URL and then assigns these pieces like controller, action, ID to those parts in the params, and then dispatches through the different parts of the Rails stack. As well, there's now this thing called format, which if you use the response to, I'll show you a little bit of that in the RESTful stuff, is really cool. The other thing you need to do is once you start up Rails, you'll get this "You're now on Rails" page, which will be your index if you just go to the root. What you want to do is send it to some controller, which is your default controller. So you do the map connect quote, which is basically nothing to that controller. And basically that will get you, that's usually the first thing you need to do. The other thing you need to remember is to remove this index.html file, or else that will get rendered, and it'll be irritating. So try to remember to read that instruction when you set up your first application. We also have this web services thing, WSDL. So if you do service.WSDL, you'll try to map it to that action called WSDL. And that's what you get. Now, let's go through some more interesting examples. So this is the basics, like xxs.com, account, balance, and then this is an ID.format. HTML will give you this. We'll match this map connect. If we leave off the format, it's going to match to this one. They're matched in the order that they appear within the file. So your most general rules should go at the bottom of the file. We can also do something much more interesting where we can say, okay, if we have a map connect of like TRX with an account, a start and an end, so we can put any parameters we want in here. We can then say, okay, map that to the controller transactions. I want to map this thing to the action list. And the requirements are that the start is a date format, the end is a date format, and the account is a bunch of digits. So we can do some fairly complex filtering on these things as well. And they're reversible. So when we're in things like a link to, or we create a form, use the form helpers, or any of those helpers, they're pretty much calling this method underneath the covers called URL_for. URL_for takes a series of optional arguments, like here's one that's fully, like it says controller is account, action is show, and ID is that. And it's going to look through its rules and basically reverse that entire process I just explained. Now, when you're already in a controller, there's some things that are defaulted. So it takes all the information that's already in your params and it applies it as defaults for URL_for. That's why we can get something as simple as link to show and then say :action show without having to specify what controller we're talking about or anything else. We can just basically say this one thing here, and it will try to figure out the rest of it using defaults from what the request was that came in before. So it really gives you a nice shorthand here. Now, before I showed you something, and basically, if I wanted to, let's say, use a shortened syntax and not have to do URL for and specify a whole bunch of crap, I could do what's called a named route. If I just do map dot, instead of connect, I use index or TRX or any other word, I can say I want to map the index to the account/controller account action index. And then I can use this shorthand, which will give me this thing here, index URL. I just have to use this one keyword. I can use that in URL anywhere I'd use a standard URL for, or I'd use a standard, or anywhere I wanted to, let's say, in a link to. I could just link to index URL in a helper like this, and it would just kind of work. Forget about the close paren. As well, if you get the more complicated version, I can say TRX URL, and I can put all this garbage in there, and it will generate a really complex-looking URL for me using that other rule. So it has all these shorthands, and when you start developing your application, basically you can use these shorthands to be able to not have to type so much on your for each one of these URLs and links and for frames and everything else, your forms. So let's see. When I'm dealing with REST, basically, does everybody know what REST is? Okay. Representational, I can't, it's too long now. I can't say that. Representational state transfer is something that's been around for quite a few years now, about 7 years, and was a paper that was written on how sort of the web done right, how you would interact with resources on the web using the basic CRUD type operations, create, read, update, delete, and how you would translate, how you would march those through different states by applying simple transformational operations. So the guys who are doing Rails basically got into this stuff, and they mapped the CRUD to your basics, get, post, put, delete, and this is show. You get the whole list of things. You can post for create, and then delete is kind of a weird one because delete has to actually do a post. Most people don't even use this. I'd say 90% of the websites out there today use just these two operations, but HTTP actually has much more functionality than that. And Rails is trying to exploit that, mainly because when you do this, you get some really interesting abilities for system integration. And the idea is that with REST, and especially with Rails, the way they've implemented it, you can change formatting from HTML to XML and basically send over operations like creating people and manipulating objects as pure web-based objects. I'll try to show you that in a demo coming up pretty soon. You can actually nest your resource mapping as well. You can do multiple level deep mapping. So basically I can have from departments, I can have employees. I could do, so I could say, departments, and then I can say employees in that department. I can also, the other thing is that it automatically creates these things called respond to, which will generate for different formats. Let me show a little bit of this. I said I was going to deploy something, so let me go ahead and do that just for the hell of it. So, talked enough about deployment. Let me see if this will actually work. So I have this RESTful application. I told you I was going to do a test. So let's just do. Actually, if you just do rake with no options, it automatically does a test. So here it goes. First test finished. Second test looked fine too. Tells you how long. There were 21. These are actually all the automatically generated tests for this little application that I came up with, this RESTful application. And this RESTful application is very similar to the one I had done with the authors and the books. I'll show you the routing file for it. So I'm mapping the resources for books, for authors to books and royalties. I'm doing books to authors and royalties. And I'm also mapping resources for royalties. These are nested, so I can say authors, books. I'll show you the URIs for this stuff. So I get back to this thing. Yeah, the other nice thing is Mongrel is very easy to run locally as well. So we have these guys here. So let's say I wanted to look at all of my books. These are all my books. So I take the first book. That's the first book. Let's say I want to see the authors of that first book. I can do that. That's what map resources gives you, this kind of URL encoding where you get this type of behavior. But let's say on top of that, I want to see all the authors, but I want to see them in XML instead of in HTML. The RESTful stuff for Rails provides this 2XML with the :include, which basically you can include sub bits as well, and allows you to immediately have this nice nested nice behavior where you can get complex objects out of the database or out of your application and refer to them using very simplistic URLs. And this is one thing that if you're going to be interacting with this application remotely, you could hook something up to this. Let's say it's a book listing site or an author listing site, and basically just query it and get this XML back and integrate this with other applications without having to do any work. And this also comes for free. When I generated this, I don't have really time to go through the whole generation. You just use scaffold resource, and that's about all there is to it. So let's go back. So here we have authors. I can add books, which will give me this form. I can then, let's see, I can show an individual. I can do a lot of that stuff. This is in the royalties section. I can now look at the royalties. I can look at an individual one. I can go back to look at, let's say, authors again. And again, we have the same base. This is all just basic scaffolding, as Armando was showing you. So that's the basics of that application. But now we're going to deploy it just for the hell of it. Now, I've already done, let's see. So the first piece is we want to set up the directory on the remote machine. OK, that worked. I haven't destroyed anything yet. Now, we want to set up our version control system. OK. Now we have SVN set up. Now there's going to be another directory, which is right here. Now this is the one that we just checked out. This came from the setup. Now we're actually pretty much there. First time you do a deploy, you do a cold deploy. That means basically deploy the application, set everything up to go, but we haven't quite bounced the server yet. The other nice thing is it asks you for your password. It asks you for it once. Never asks for it again during the entire process. Now it's creating all the stuff. Started. Seems like it's working.
Your CD failed?
I think we're OK. 1 second. Let me see.
Well, there goes your production app.
Nah. Let's see.
Yeah, if your phone rings now, you're in pain.
I'm fearless. Okay, and I just want to restart the web server. That basically just does an Apache control. Let's see what happened. Oops, didn't actually work. So, let me see if I skipped a step there. Aha, I did forget a step. Oh, okay. Okay, something just happened. I forgot whether I put the password into this file. I might not have, which may cause me a few problems. Okay, starting at 2. So that time it actually started. Getting closer. And now I think what I forgot to do, I just told you, is I forgot to change something in my database.yml file, and I did. So I need to somehow do something. Don't mind the man behind the conversion. The current. This is a production site, so I don't want to actually everybody know my password. Sorry, which I forgot to do. So, but basically, the system has been configured. What's wrong is it now can't reach the database because I forgot to put in the correct database password into the site. Actually, I forgot the database password because it's something really goofy. Okay. 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 I need some elevator music during that. So, what I need to do now is basically recommit. Oh, wait. I need to recommit that. And I need to find my shell. Create a new one. I might need to do a deploy with migrations. I might as well just do that to kind of make sure that everything is correctly out there. So what this is doing is basically just checking out the code, making sure everything is set up, and as I skipped one step, I kind of forgot to create the database, so things didn't go that well. Oh, okay. And because I have an older version of Rails out there, I need to get rid of this line here. Because one thing is that Rails is tied to a particular version, so if you there we go. And so far, I don't think I've destroyed my site. So, okay, so let's get ready to finish this up. Oh, I know what happened. That's what happens when you don't practice this thing. Okay, so servers. Let me just make sure I got this right. Okay. Well, let's hope for the best.
We're going to have to sacrifice the rest of the live demo.
Yeah, well, I thought it would work easier than this. Let's try the cold deploy first. I might not be able to get this guy running. Well, it's getting closer.
You're getting closer to getting an angry phone call.
Nah, I think the rest of the site's still up. So I mean, the thing is that these are all isolated. So if I do, yeah, it still works. So this is just a subdomain. One nice thing is I can keep all my applications separate. And what's going wrong is that I screwed up in the beginning because I didn't have the configuration correctly for the database, so I need to recreate the database. I might have to do that manually, or just restart all over again, because in the first step, it creates the database for you as part of these initial steps, and I think it thinks that it's already created, so it's not going to, there it goes. Oh, that's why, okay. I didn't give it the right password for the database. Which is why it didn't work, and I should have remembered that. So, okay. Okay. Now, if I'd followed the instructions, it would have been a lot better. Okay. Not as impressive as I would have hoped. Okay. Well, oh well. Try one more time and I'm going to give it up. Basically, it's usually easier than this. It's because I'm dealing with a lot of, I have a very bizarre setup because I'm running a Java application here and a couple of other web applications. I think this one may be getting into a bit of competition with them, which means I have to probably go back and fix everything else as well. But it's usually just about five commands and it works. And it's actually getting to the application now, but something's going wrong in the application. So I'm not sure if it's just the migrations have failed. Might be just that. So it's usually pretty straightforward to do drops. And once you do something, you basically just do a cat -a deploy, and it pretty much will cycle your server through everything. The way it works is like for the status page, which you saw before, that something, basically the one that says it's being updated. That page is just stuffed into your shared directories, and then Apache looks for a page there. If the page is there, it serves up that instead of the rest of the content. So it's pretty straightforward. Aha! Wait, something just happened. That works. Okay. Yeah. And if I had done, let's see, so let's go back to, let's say, books. Create that. Okay, go back to authors, add the book, programming Ruby. There we go. Now Dave Thomas has a book. If you go, let's say, to authors, you'll see that, and then you can see books. Same way we had local. So it actually did work. We got through the deploy. So the answer there was, don't forget to put your password into the database.yml file. And then when it asks for your database password, don't type in the other password. So it makes it work a lot smoother. But that's about it. Deployment, believe it or not, is easy. If I make a change locally now, what I was telling you before, if I, let's say, changed my views and I want to say in layouts, I have the author's layout. And I create something like that. All I got to do is do SVN. Commit that change, sends it, and deploy that change out there. And you're basically done. I was just saying about 30 seconds. It's already checked out the code. Now it's going to bounce the mongrels for me. And put up that page, and now the mongrels are getting bounced, starting and stopping. Now it's all done. Now if I go to that authors page, you'll see hello down there. So interacting with your deployed environment is very easy. Once you get all your recipes set up, it's usually just a few commands to be able to put it out there. It's about 1 minute. If you do all your testing, you run your tests before you do your deploy. And tend to run into very few problems. It's a really nice system. So, any other questions on what we've gone over?
We're down to really just the few hardcore people here. I know that we went about half an hour or so later. Those of you who have cars here, you've got time, don't worry. Thank you all very much for being our guinea pigs. We haven't tried doing this before. It's likely we'll do it again. and you can expect to receive an email from me in the next day or so with a link to a SurveyMonkey survey. Please take a few minutes to fill it out. I mean, you did get a free sandwich, so I think fair is fair. And of course, you can email either of us if you have other feedback that is stuff that's not included in the survey. If you go to the page that we sent a link in the original email, the course homepage, we're going to have the slides as well as a link to the streaming video up there. And I think that about does it for now. Thank you guys all very much for your attention, for your forbearance, and for tolerating the fact that we ran late. And if anybody wants to hang around and talk further or have a beer, I'm open to all buyers. Thanks very much.
Excellent.